Hello everyone, today I bring you a very interesting manhwa. I hope you like it. Now let's go to the video. The story begins with a reporter in the middle of the street working on a story. He approaches people and asks what they would do with 100 million won in their account. The girl being interviewed quickly replies to the reporter that 100 million won is not enough to buy a house. Another says he would like to trade in his car, while others think about saving for the future. The reporter then changes his question and asks people what they would do if they became the richest person in the world. The interviewees show surprise, and some respond. The camera then transitions back to the studio, where the host comments on the wide variety of reactions. The host then asks a question to the young man sitting in front of her, addressing him as the first and youngest Korean to achieve such wealth. She asks, "What is the secret to becoming the richest person in the world? There are rumors about you being able to predict the future." The young man, with a slight laugh before answering, says that seeing the future is impossible. However, this young man, with his keen gaze, can indeed foresee the future. He modestly tells the host that he is just a lucky investor. The narrative moves to the present time, focusing on the protagonist Kang Jin-hoo. Recently discharged from the military and currently unemployed, he lives with his mother in a small basement apartment. The story picks up as Kang Jin-hoo wakes up after a not-so-restful night. Startled, he murmurs the name of Sergeant Kang Jin-hoo, complaining about having the same dream again, a dream involving an eagle he had seen in the army. He admits that it starts as a good dream, but the eagle's appearance ruins everything. Sitting up in bed and looking around, the protagonist reflects on how his life wasn't always as bleak as it is now. Once, he had a dependable father who ran a decent business and a gentle mother who seemed as delicate as a flower. He remembers living a sheltered life, much like a flower in a greenhouse. Now, with his father gone, Jin-hoo takes on all kinds of odd jobs to make ends meet. As he sits on his bed, he sighs, gazing at a family photo. A while later, while chatting with his friend, the protagonist confides that his life still hasn't changed. His friend hands him a drink and disagrees, pointing out that his collection is twice as vibrant now. Jin-hoo argues that his collection has been massive since high school, making it hard to notice any differences. His friend, Oh Tae-kyu, who wears glasses, insists that Jin-hoo lacks an eye for detail. Tae-kyu then asks what Jin-hoo plans to do next. Jin-hoo replies that despite being broke, he still has a degree from a prestigious university, and will probably tutor students to ease his mother's burden. He also mentions possibly delaying his return to school. The two toast, and Tae-kyu congratulates Jin-hoo for being such a devoted son. Jin-hoo thanks him for the compliment and for having dinner with his mother last Christmas in his stead. Tae-kyu, modest as always, says it was nothing. They're like family after all. Jin-hoo's mother is like his own. The conversation shifts to Jin-hoo's time in the army. Raising his hand dismissively, Jin-hoo asks what he could say that Tae-kyu would understand since he never served. Tae-kyu, surprised, remarks on how bitter Jin-hoo has become and teasingly asks if Jin-hoo wants to make him more envious. Jin-hoo replies, asking what else he could say to spark envy. Tae-kyu leans closer, lowers his voice, and reveals with a smirk that he has found the password to his Bantcoin account. Confused, Jin-hoo asks what Bantcoin is. Tae-kyu, feigning disbelief, asks if Jin-hoo has truly forgotten, and explains. Rutnia, the virtual currency Jin-hoo earned by selling his character from the game Rutnia. Surprised, the protagonist recalls and confirms that those 50 million won he cried over, as if his life was over when he lost the password, are indeed real. Curious, he asks again if Tae-kyu really managed to remember the password. Tae-kyu quickly says he found it while cleaning out his sticker cabinet. Then he asks the protagonist if he knows how much it's worth now. The protagonist asks how much. Tae-kyu responds that until yesterday, it was valued at $1,120. The protagonist repeats, "What? $1,120? Then, calculating with the current exchange rate, where $1 is worth about 1,098 won. Guys, I took a break from the manhwa to say that if you like the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. But 90% of those who watch the video don't subscribe, so I'm counting on your help. Now let's go back to the manhwa. He stammers that it amounts to 1.22 million won. However, Tae-kyu points his pinky finger upward and clarifies 1 Bant coin. The protagonist, confused by what he means, watches as Taikyu, still holding his pinky up, says, "Not 1,120 in total, but 1,120 per Bant coin." Breaking into a cold sweat, the protagonist puts a hand on his chin and says, since he has 11,000 BNT, he thinks, and then, shocked, exclaims that he has 13.5 billion won. Stunned by the math, he quickly stands up and asks if he's gone mad or is dreaming. Seeing him shout, Taikyu asks why he's swearing, suggesting that if he's jealous, he should just admit it. Calming down slightly, Taikyu affirms that it took him a while to accept it, but now he's come to terms with reality. Seizing the moment, the protagonist asks Taikyu for a loan of 100 million won. Taikyu easily refuses. He asks again, but Taikyu declines once more, stating he's already put the coins on the exchange platform and that it looks like the value is continuing to rise. The protagonist calls Taikyu stingy and, regretting it, says he should have taken gaming more seriously as well. As he recalls his gaming days, something comes to mind. Grabbing Taikyu by the collar, he yells, accusing him of forgetting that he sold his character back then. Shaking him, he demands his share, calling him a thief. Taikyu gives in and asks what his share is. The protagonist thinks about how much it should be. Looking out the window, he sees the eagle from his dreams again. This eagle, seemingly surrounded by a golden aura, surprises the protagonist by reappearing. The eagle flies toward him, perching on his head and emitting golden auras before vanishing into small balls of light. These lights transform into words in the air, visible only to him. Not understanding much of what the words mean, he asks Taikyu if he knows anything about Mountain Hill. Surprised, Taikyu asks how he knows where he's trading his Bant coin and how he could possibly know that. With the words indicating Mountain Hill's bankruptcy, the protagonist asks him if he's certain it's safe and whether there are rumors about a collapse or anything like that. Taikyu, puzzled, asks what he's talking about, wondering why a perfectly fine exchange platform would go bankrupt. The protagonist grows pensive. That eagle and those cards are exactly like what he saw in the army. He starts questioning if this is real or just a hallucination. Resolving himself, he tells Taikyu to listen carefully from now on. He demands that Taikyu sell all his Bant coin immediately. Taikyu refuses, saying it's too sudden. Grabbing and shaking him again, the protagonist insists that he can't explain now and tells him to just trust him. Seeing his desperation, Taikyu relents, saying he'll sell everything. He's already asked his sister to open a dollar account so he can sell. Afterward, he demands an explanation. The protagonist sits back down, agreeing, while the golden letters in his vision fade away. He reflects on the eagle and those cards again, wondering if this isn't just his imagination. How could he have recognized the name of that exchange platform? Perhaps he heard about it before and forgot? Taikyu, checking his phone, suddenly stands up, alarmed, announcing that Mountain Hill's server is down. The protagonist, disbelieving, stammers, asking what happened to the Bant coin. Taikyu, sweating with relief, shows his phone, confirming he managed to sell just in time. He starts searching for answers, speculating it might just be maintenance. The protagonist, still in disbelief, questions what the hell is going on. Is this really happening again? Taikyu shouts God's name in surprise. Curious, the protagonist asks what happened. Taikyu explains the server came back quickly, but all accounts have been completely emptied. On the site's forum, everyone is losing their minds over Mountain Hill. Shocked by the situation, Taikyu grabs the protagonist and demands to know the truth. What's really happening, and how did he know this would happen? Unable to explain, the protagonist tries to stall, but Taikyu, impatient, tells him to speak clearly. Gathering courage, the protagonist finally admits, I might have gained the ability to see the future. Now let's see the events of 1 year ago regarding the protagonist. We observe a mortar shooting range, Regiment 20, Division 10. His superior was shouting, Kang Jin-hoo, stop being so careless and pay attention. They'll ask you about this when you return to the base. Understand? and yelling. The protagonist replied, "Soldier Kang Jin-hoo. Understood, sir." After that, he noticed an eagle staring at him. The eagle, with all its beauty, passed right in front of the protagonist, startling him. He immediately asked his comrades if they had also seen the eagle, but they replied by asking where. The protagonist explained that it had just flown over their heads, but the soldier replied he hadn't seen anything. Convinced he had seen the eagle, the protagonist asked how it was possible not to notice something so big. Then, in his vision, words appeared. Explosion. Without understanding, the protagonist wondered what it was, if it might be some sort of technology. However, it was something they were naturally accustomed to seeing during training. Explosion at kilometer 188. The mortar. Following that event, he could say with certainty that when a human instinctively senses their life is in danger, the body reacts before the mind comprehends it. Immediately after, the mortar exploded. Returning to the present moment, Taekyu comments that the protagonist was very lucky. Despite being so close, he wasn't injured. The protagonist agrees, acknowledging that it was an accident with fatal victims, but thanks to that mysterious warning, he survived. Curious, Taekyu asks what the military doctor had said. The protagonist explains that the doctor mentioned the accident caused some memory trauma. Taekyu calls it a vague response and says that if the protagonist has experienced this phenomenon twice, it's not a coincidence, it's a superpower. The protagonist, surprised by the mention of a superpower, replies, "Let's suppose you're right, but why did you believe that so easily?" Taekyu explains that he has never underestimated the power of the mind, a conviction he gained from watching anime. Even if a cute elf girl appeared in front of him, he'd believe it. The protagonist quickly shifts the conversation. Anyway, let's focus on what really matters. Taekyu, in an ironic tone, asks, "And what's more important?" Without hesitation, the protagonist states, "My share of the 1.24 billion won. When you sold your Lutnia character, you also sold my low-level character. Of the 11,000 BNT you received, 1,000 BNT were my share. That's about 9.1% of the 13.5 billion won you just earned. So if you don't pay me, I'll burn all your collectible figures." Taekyu complains, saying he was planning to give the protagonist the character earlier, but now he's threatening him before they even negotiate. He adds that regardless, even if he wanted to give something, he couldn't give it all because of tax issues. The protagonist admits he expected that, and jokingly asks if Taekyu is planning to open a tax haven. "How did you know?" Taekyu replies. The protagonist reminds him, "Did you forget? I graduated in economics at Korea University." Taekyu then explains that his sister had told him that if income tax were generated from Bankcoin, he could end up paying billions. Hence, he managed to set up a tax haven in a U.S. territory called Della Island. He even created a company named OTK Company. The protagonist questions, "Is OTK an abbreviation for otaku?" Slightly irritated, Taekyu clarifies, "It stands for Otaikyu." He then proudly announces that all that's left now is to live a leisurely life forever. The protagonist, sarcastic, asks, "Haven't you been doing that all along?" Taekyu counters, claiming that making a living by trading game items isn't easy, and that Bankcoin isn't simply the result of that. Acknowledging this, the protagonist requests his 1.24 billion won share. Taekyu assures him he'll transfer it, and the protagonist, smiling, reflects on how his discharge day has left him with 1.24 billion won. After going to the bank to withdraw his money and celebrate, he remembers something Taekyu said, "Don't celebrate too soon." Recalling this, the protagonist realizes the reason. The money Taekyu was giving him was a gift, so once it left the tax haven and entered Korea, it would be taxed at 20%, with a progressive rate for larger amounts. Taekyu had explained this to him earlier and promised to give him 500 million first, while figuring out how to get the remaining 740 million with his sister's help. Back at the bank's exit, the protagonist, still lost in his thoughts, hopes this isn't a dream. He starts thinking about what to do with the money. First, he considers helping his mother take a break from work and buying her some new clothes. Walking into a large shopping mall, the protagonist starts planning his purchases. Suddenly, he hears a commotion. Curious, he approaches and sees a heated argument. A young woman, visibly upset, is arguing over some shoes. She mockingly says the person she's arguing with couldn't afford them even after scrubbing floors 1,000 times. The store manager bows, apologizing to the rude woman, and then turns to another woman, an older one, and, shockingly, demands that she kneel. To the protagonist's horror, the older woman being humiliated is none other than his mother. Soon, he is surprised to see his mother there, being scolded. The woman abused just because she has some money. The abusive woman yells, asking if she will kneel or pay for the shoes. The manager, calling her old, questions if she really wants to be fired and demands that she apologize to the customer. He watches her dressed in a different outfit and quickly remembers what she said before, that she worked at a call center for a department store. Just as she is about to kneel, the protagonist quickly grabs her by the arms, stopping her. While holding her, he asks, "What is so important to you that you demand someone kneel? Speak, I'll listen." Seeing him, his mother feels a mix of sadness and shame. The abusive woman immediately yells, asking, "Who is he to interfere? Is he perhaps her son or something?" The protagonist confirms, saying he is her son. His mother tries to apologize, saying the young man doesn't know her, but the protagonist calls her mother and asks if she is ashamed of him. He then affirms that he is not ashamed of her. Turning to the abusive woman, he asks what is going on. She says the mop touched her shoe. Furious, the protagonist asks, "Is that all? For such a minor reason, you want someone's mother to kneel?" The woman angrily asks if he knows how much her shoes cost. She states they cost 600,000 won. The protagonist pulls out 600,000 won from his pocket and offers it to her, asking her to apologize to his mother and leave. He adds that she can keep her precious shoes, or walk away empty-handed. A bystander warns her that she is being filmed and suggests it would be better to accept the money. The protagonist then asks if he should throw it on the floor for her to pick up. Swallowing her pride, she avoids eye contact, apologizes, and grabs the money from his hand. While counting it, the protagonist tells the manager to collect her shoes, since they now belong to him after he just bought them. He warns that if the shoes are not there by tomorrow, he will report them as stolen. The manager agrees. The protagonist then takes his mother and leaves the store. The abusive woman calls him stingy and asks him to wait, claiming he won't even use the shoes. The protagonist retorts that he probably doesn't need them and plans to throw them in the trash tomorrow. Mockingly, he thanks her, calling her Miss Old Lady, leaving her furious and screaming throughout the store like a madwoman. Outside the mall, walking down the street, the protagonist's mother tells him that if she goes back to talk to them, perhaps she can fix the situation. Curious, the protagonist asks her when this started. His mother places her hand on his shoulder and says it was just today. The protagonist hugs her and asks, "What I want to know is when did you start getting so thin?" His mother asks what he means by thin, adding that it's the first time she's gone through something like this. The protagonist insists she doesn't need to work in a place where she is treated like that. From now on, he will take care of everything. Surprised by his words, she asks when her Jin-hoo grew up so much. They then go somewhere to have dinner. The protagonist apparently shares some things about B&T with her. Curious, she asks why they are so expensive. He tells her to think of it as a game item and assures her that she doesn't need to worry about college tuition. He can take care of her now. However, she says that's nonsense. The money is his. She has already reserved the tuition, so he just needs to focus on returning to school, saving that money, and investing in his future. The protagonist says he'll think about it later. Right now, they need to move because he suspects her cough is due to the house. She tells him to stop worrying about it, but Jin-hoo seriously declares he will use his money for something that truly matters. She sighs, saying he is as stubborn as his father. The protagonist receives a call from Taekyu and answers. Taekyu sounds desperate, saying there is an emergency. The protagonist asks what he's talking about, explaining that he is having dinner with his mother. Desperate, Taekyu says, "She's here. She showed up, my sister." My sister is back in Korea. We see the Namsan Shillon Hotel, and we see Taekyu driving his rather embarrassing car. Soon, the valet offers to do his job for Taekyu. As they are about to enter the hotel, Taekyu asks why he's complaining after they had so much fun. The protagonist tells him not to drag him into his nerdy world. Then someone comments that they are 3 minutes late, and it's Taekyu's sister, Hyunju. They start talking about the delay and ask each other if they are okay. Soon, they enter the hotel, and while sitting and drinking tea, Hyun asks if the protagonist has finished his military service. The protagonist says it was not long ago. She adds, saying that when he graduates, why doesn't he come work with her at Golden Gate? The protagonist says he would love to, and if Seal Global accepts him, he's in. The protagonist asks if she's worried about something, and turning to Taekyu, she says, Mountain Hill. She mentions hearing they went bankrupt. Taekyu immediately says that fortunately, he sold everything before it happened. She is surprised that he managed to sell everything. He tells her that he deposited everything into OTK's company account, about $11.9 million. His sister says, that's a relief. The protagonist wonders if she was very worried. She places a sheet of paper on the table and says, here, take this. These are the contact details of the Golden Gate branch manager in Gangnam. If you need to transfer a large amount to a domestic account, you can contact this person to handle it. Just mention that you're Oh Hyun-ju's younger brother, and he will take care of everything for you. Then she asks why he said he would sell slowly, but ended up selling everything at once. Trying to cover it up, Taekyu says he just felt like selling it all at once. The protagonist asks if she came there because of Taekyu, but she says no. She's there for an audit of the acquiring company, so she'll be staying for about 10 days. Surprised and scared, Taekyu repeats, 10 days? She asks if he has a problem with that, and stammering, Taekyu says no. He says he's happy about it and asks where she will be staying. She says she's at this hotel where they are now. Taekyu is surprised because the hotel is expensive. She explains that the entire audit team is staying there together, and anyway, the company is paying. The protagonist thinks it costs $500,000 a night to stay at this hotel and realizes her company is really different. She gets up and informs them that she has a call to take. She moves away and starts talking on the phone. Taekyu, scared, asks the protagonist if his sister's personality doesn't scare him. The protagonist says it's his fault for making him feel that way. Taekyu asks what he did, but before saying anything, his sister arrives and says, "You were waiting, right? It's because of the OPEC meeting schedule." Pensive, Taekyu says, OPEC, and asks if it's the Organization of Oil Factories. The protagonist thinks that all he knows is that factory starts with F and has nothing to do with OPEC. Looking at her, he says, "That's the abbreviation for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, right?" His sister confirms he's correct and clarifies that it stands for the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. She explains that the results of the OPEC meeting will be announced the day after tomorrow. However, as she talks about the meeting, the protagonist suddenly envisions a large eagle with a majestic aura flying over him again, transforming into words. He reads, OPEC Production Cut Agreement. Taekyu's sister asks if he's okay since he seems distracted. The protagonist says he's fine and apologizes, saying he was lost in thought for a moment. She asks if he's perhaps tired because of Taekyu. The protagonist sarcastically responds that it's always because of him. Taekyu asks why he's so insistent today. Looking seriously at her, the protagonist calls her sis and asks what the OPEC meeting is about. She says they are currently in Kuwait for a production cut meeting. Surprised, the protagonist says, "Production cut?" He realizes that's exactly what he just saw from the eagle. Taekyu asks why that's so important. She explains that if representatives of financial assets are stocks and bonds, then representatives of real assets are oil and gold. For example, with the world's 3 main types of oil, even as a producer country, the U.S. doesn't produce enough to meet demand. Despite being an oil-producing country, they have remained the largest importer. However, due to the development of shale gas and oil, the U.S. has emerged as a new supplier, a phenomenon called the shale revolution. The biggest drawback of shale oil is its high production cost, estimated at about $45 per barrel. So if oil prices drop below $50 per barrel, it's predicted that more than half of the companies will go bankrupt. That's why OPEC member countries have rushed to hold several meetings to discuss production cuts. However, the interests of oil-producing countries are deeply intertwined, so these meetings always end in failure. The protagonist sincerely asks what she expects from this new meeting. She honestly replies that it will likely end without an agreement. They are barely managing to keep the price around $60 per barrel, and if this fails, it will drop below $50. The protagonist asks what would happen if an agreement were reached. She says oil prices would soar and the market would celebrate, but the chance of that happening is very low. The protagonist asks again, "Still, do you think they might reach an agreement this time?" Surprised by the repeated question, she asks why he thinks so. The protagonist realizes he said it without thinking and tells her it would just be nice if it worked out that way. She says it would be nice, but hope and prediction are different things. We see them in Taikyu's car again. The protagonist, with his head against the window, is deep in thought. He wonders if the OPEC production cut agreement will really succeed as he saw. If oil prices soar, then buying crude oil in advance could yield significant profits. He begins to think about how he predicted the mortar explosion and Mountain Hill's bankruptcy, so there's a possibility he could also foresee this OPEC agreement. The problem is investment capital. He recently signed a rental contract and plans to give $100 million to his mother, so the money he can use now is 275 million won from his account, plus 740 million from Taikyu's account. He seriously considers investing it all. While driving, Taikyu interrupts his thoughts, asking if it happened again when he was talking to his sister earlier. The protagonist soon says that he really has a sharp perception. Curious, Taikyu tells him to share what he saw this time. He quickly thinks of Taikyu differently and begins to explain that he predicted the production cut agreement. Taikyu asks if he means that if the agreement happens, oil prices will rise, and they would have to buy it in advance. The protagonist confirms, and Taikyu, skeptical, asks how he plans to buy oil, if he's going to stack barrels in his house. The protagonist tells him to keep his eyes on the road while driving. In their room, at the computer, the protagonist says, according to Hyun, WTI is barely managing to stay around $60 per barrel. Taikyu is surprised, asking if that's serious. He says he heard his sister explain it before, but it didn't seem impactful. The protagonist explains that crude oil isn't just used for fueling cars, it's utilized across various industries. Therefore, an increase in oil prices significantly impacts producer costs. He then asks how much Taikyu still has. Taikyu says he will send him $500 million, adding that he still has $12 billion left, while the protagonist has about $673 million. Taikyu asks where they can buy WTI now. The protagonist says on the New York Mercantile Exchange and suggests that since they don't know what will happen, it's better to bet just $300,000 for now. Taikyu says he'll buy some for himself, too. The protagonist asks how much he plans to buy. Taikyu says $10 million. The protagonist asks if he means won, but Taikyu replies in dollars. The protagonist accuses him of going crazy, explaining that the deal was for a small amount. Taikyu asks if $5 million would be better. Furious, the protagonist asks if Taikyu can't handle money because he acquired it too quickly. Scratching his head, he explains to Taikyu that this is not a guaranteed bet. Taikyu argues that the protagonist said he had a clear prediction. The protagonist asks when it became a certain prediction. Taikyu agrees to limit himself to $3 million. The protagonist drops the argument, telling him to do whatever he wants. The market is predicting the production cut agreement will fail, and expectations are already reflected in the prices. Oil prices have dropped as much as they can, so even if the cut doesn't happen, the decrease won't be too significant. If he's wrong, he plans to take a small loss and sell. Together with Taikyu, they have a total of $3.3 million. This isn't something he closely monitors. It's based on uncertain information. With just a few taps in a small studio, he clicks, thinking it's time to start the investment. Taikyu asks if he bought it. The protagonist says yes. Taikyu asks what's next. The protagonist says they need to wait for the OPEC meeting to end. While helping his mother move, the protagonist thinks that, luckily, he managed to buy a 2-bedroom apartment for around 120 million won. It's quite old, but the wallpaper and flooring were renovated, so the interior is clean. He asks his mother if she likes the house. She quickly responds that, of course. There are 2 bedrooms, and the sunlight comes in beautifully. It's very nice. The protagonist reflects that if he hadn't spent more, he might have found an even better place, but he feels relieved that she likes it. In one box, there's a photo frame turned face down. She picks it up and looks at the photo. The protagonist notices and reflects that with every move, their house only got smaller. As the space decreased, the things of his father were, little by little, losing their place. These are things his mother couldn't bring herself to get rid of. The memories of the protagonist's father. His mother's old dream was to have her own house. His father had bought a piece of land to fulfill that dream and built a house, which was the first home, where the protagonist was born and raised. Most family memories are there. Curious, the protagonist asks his mother if she thinks about his father a lot. She, with tearful eyes, says, "Of course, he worked so hard only to leave early. If he had lived, he would have seen days like today, too." Soon, she breaks into tears, but she wipes her tears and says she needs to clean more things, asking the protagonist to go to his room and unpack. The protagonist agrees, but before leaving, he stops and thinks about things they urgently need: a washing machine, refrigerator, dining table, and beds. He realizes they have to buy everything again. Soon, he tells his mother to take some time off from work. She asks how she could stay at home doing nothing while being healthy. The protagonist asks her to take 3 months, please. She then reluctantly agrees, saying, "Fine if it makes you happy." He hands her something and tells her he deposited 100 million won into her account for her to use as she wishes. She is surprised, but soon starts hitting him, asking if he's going around distributing money just because he has some. However, the protagonist says she isn't just anyone. She says she has her savings and doesn't need it, telling him to save it for buying a house later or for his wedding fund. The protagonist insists and says she should just consider it as him leaving it with her for now. She then agrees and remarks again that he is as stubborn as his father. The protagonist feels satisfied and thinks that even after giving his mother 100 million won and paying the deposit, he still has 274 million in his account. He calculates he'll need to pay around 100 million in taxes, but Taikyu still owes him 740 million. With that money, he wouldn't have to worry for at least 20 years. Looking out the window of his new house, he wonders if making money is really that easy. Just then, Taikyu arrives at their house, calling his mother and announcing his arrival. She asks if he's had lunch yet. Taikyu says he hasn't, hands toilet paper to the protagonist, and says it's mandatory to order jjajangmyeon on moving day. He adds that since it'll go on his account, she has to order later. The protagonist, not too pleased, asks why someone as rich as Taikyu only brought toilet paper as a housewarming gift. Taikyu asks what he should have brought instead. The protagonist says something like a refrigerator, a stove, or a flat-screen TV. Taikyu jokingly accuses him of trying to extort him. They then sit down and start talking while eating apples. The protagonist mentions he saw on the news about Mountain Hill's bankruptcy. Taikyu says it's chaos because of it. Mountain Hill is the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, and the damage caused by the hacking is estimated to be between billions and even 1 trillion won. Normally, Mountain Hill would compensate for the loss, but the scale was too large for a single exchange to handle. In the end, Mountain Hill began bankruptcy proceedings. The protagonist asks what happened to the people who invested in Bitcoin. Taikyu replies that they're all ruined. He explains that if something like this happened to a bank, the government would intervene to offer compensation measures. However, since there's no regulatory authority for Bitcoin, no organization can propose a solution or compensate for the losses. Taikyu then comments seriously that the protagonist is impressive. He predicted Mountain Hill's bankruptcy. The protagonist says it might have been just a coincidence, but without much conviction. Taikyu, with a serious look, says nothing in life happens by chance. He has that feeling. Sweating nervously, the protagonist asks if Taikyu had another intuition. Taikyu then says his superpower was awakened in a moment of crisis. The protagonist calls him crazy. Taikyu continues, saying that's how heroes are born, and urges him to think carefully about it. The Oracle's Eye. The protagonist thinks it's nonsense. Taikyu says they'll call this power of his the Oracle's Eye, and asks if he thinks it's cool. The protagonist says it's not cool and suggests worrying about the OPEC meeting instead. Taikyu ignores him and says, the Oracle's Eye. I'll call it that from now on. The protagonist asks if he's talking to the walls, urging him to pay attention. He says if the prediction about the OPEC meeting is correct, he might consider the name, but if they fail this time, they'll lose a lot of money and it won't be trustworthy. Taikyu says you never know. If he gets OPEC right too, he'll call him the Oracle's Eye. The protagonist replies, fine, do whatever you want, adding that he'd also like it to be true. The next day, the protagonist asks Taikyu, who's playing video games, if today is the day for the results and if Hyun said anything. Taikyu replies that she mentioned they'll know by tomorrow. The protagonist shakes his head and says it's too suspenseful. He starts wondering if he was wrong, if it's not working. Oil prices have fallen another 3%, and summing everything, they're at a loss of 100 million won, with prices continuing to drop. Sad, he begins to think that maybe he was wrong this time. The protagonist asks if Taikyu is okay. Taikyu says they have the Oracle's Eye, or has he forgotten? The protagonist asks when it became our Oracle's Eye. Taikyu suggests they play a bit since they'll know the answer tomorrow. The protagonist asks which game he wants to play. Taikyu says a dating simulator. While playing, the protagonist thinks about 1.24 billion in a day. If he thinks carefully, it's not enough to live comfortably. Spending everything would lead to bankruptcy. He recalls a story of someone who won the lottery and became homeless after 10 years. To avoid that, he needs to stay grounded and live wisely. However, when he thinks about having so much money, he wonders if he still needs to keep looking for tutoring jobs. Taikyu, who was shaking him while he was lost in thought, makes him fall asleep there from thinking too much. The next day, Taikyu wakes the protagonist, saying the results are finally out. The protagonist wakes up in a hurry, grabs his phone, and starts checking the news. OPEC reached a dramatic production cut agreement. Non-OPEC countries joined production cuts. International oil prices soar after the production cut decision. The protagonist wonders if this is really happening. He quickly checks the WTI price on the commodity exchange, which is at $73. Surprised, he notes it has risen more than 20% in minutes. He tells Taikyu to check his account since all he predicted was the production cut. He doesn't know what will happen next, so it's better to sell everything now. Taikyu agrees it's a good idea. After selling, the protagonist asks how much they earned. Taikyu says 630,000, which in won would be 700 million. So, his share would be around 60,000, right? That totals 800 million. The protagonist is surprised. The 740 million won Taikyu owed became 800 million. Taikyu regretfully says he should have invested the $10 million. With a tone of irony, the protagonist says everyone says that when they win. Taikyu reminds him this was the third time. The protagonist asks what he means. Taikyu says he predicts whether something will happen or not. For instance, if Mountain Hill will go bankrupt or not, or if the production cut agreement will happen or not. It might happen once or twice, but since this is the third time, his power of prediction is real. The protagonist doesn't understand much and wonders if he really gained powers, like the superpowers from children's comics and movies. His friend remarks, normally, when people think of superpowers, they think of flying, destroying buildings with their hands, or controlling objects with their minds. Compared to that, prediction might seem like nothing. But if you think about it, you can fly in an airplane and destroy buildings with excavators. These superpowers can be replaced by machines. However, Predicting the future cannot be substituted, not even now with advances in computers and artificial intelligence. It is still impossible to see the future. Elections, sports, natural disasters, and more. If you can accurately predict all these things, that is the most insane ability of all. Soon, they ask when this started happening. A friend comments that he called it a latent superpower awakened in an emergency situation, the incident with the mortar. In other words, an awakening. The protagonist then asks how it started happening recently. He thinks that if he had this ability before, he would have rushed to a casino during vacation. Not that a casino is the only way. There are many ways he could make money. But after that day, he didn't see anything else, so he thought it was just a hallucination and let it go. He asks his friend how it started appearing now. His friend thinks and mentions when they talked about Bitcoin and the OPEC meeting with his sister. Maybe the prediction only works when it is related to finances. The protagonist comments that it is not a bad theory and asks about the mortar explosion, considering it is only related to finances. Still thoughtful, his friend says it was a life or death situation, so it must be considered an exception. But then he realizes something while asking the protagonist what happened after the explosion. Confused, the protagonist asks what he means. His friend explains that it became big news. Exactly that case was related to corruption in military procurement. The KM-188 that exploded was defective from the start. As a result, the shares of Huan Chemical Products, which supplied the KM-188, as well as defense contracts, plummeted. So, it was related to the economy. The protagonist agrees that he is not wrong, but points out that most things that happen in the world are directly or indirectly related to the economy. The protagonist's friend comes closer and says he has a new idea. The protagonist comments that when he says something, it is usually nonsense, but he'll listen. His friend says, "I'll bring the capital and you'll bring the powers. We'll invest together and split the profits. What do you think?" The protagonist responds that it's a very tempting offer, but asks, "What if we lose? I'll have to cover half, won't I?" His friend replies that he doesn't have money to pay everything back if that happens. They wouldn't be able to do anything. Pensive, the protagonist thinks he would likely have to bear all the losses. He considers that this kind of deal is basically a gamble. The protagonist comments, "If possible, I'd love to do this, but realistically, there's a big problem. If this power is real, we have no guarantee that the prediction will be 100% accurate. What if it only shows a random future with a high probability of occurring?" He asks if it's really reliable to trust this kind of prediction to invest. Investments require clear and reliable sources. If it's not reliable, it's useless. Even if it's correct now, it could be wrong next time, he says. Just because I've seen white swans doesn't mean there are no black swans. That's the flaw in your reasoning. If the prediction is wrong, we could lose tens of billions. Can we even handle that kind of situation? He asks. His friend responds, "If your power is real, this is an incredible opportunity. You have a power. I have 13 billion won. If we combine these two things, we can make a huge amount of money," and he calls him to be part of it, or calls him to join the world of investments. The curious protagonist asks what he will do if he doesn't hold his hand. His friend comments that he will never see him again. Sarcastically, the protagonist comments that this friendship is shallow. With unshakable determination, his friend says, "Come on, my friend, take my hand. Come on, quickly, take it now." However, soon the phone rings. The protagonist answers and speaks with Min Young, while his friend keeps waving his hand. She says they have a meeting with other people and invites him to go because Gi Hong will be there. She saw that he had been dismissed and wants to see him. The protagonist comments that if he is definitely there, he will see him and asks when it will be. She mentions they will meet at a bar in front of the school in an hour. The protagonist agrees, hangs up the phone, and quickly gets ready to leave, putting on his coat. He comments that he has an appointment now. He tries to escape while his friend insists they haven't finished talking yet. Already at the bar, the protagonist enters. Some extras, or Sergeant Kong, are called. The protagonist approaches the table, touches one of the extras' hands, and comments about being a reservist now. The extra asks if the military service was worth it. Ironically, the protagonist says, if you can avoid it, and asks who the people at the table are. Then, an extra with light hair stands up and says he will introduce them. They are freshmen who entered this year, and he also introduces the protagonist to them. Politely, they introduce themselves by saying their names. The protagonist asks, "Where is Gi Hong?" The extra replies, saying something happened, so he will be late. "Let's start already," and he serves a drink to the protagonist. The curious extra asks if he plans to return to college. The protagonist says he is thinking about it, while pondering that now the problems at home are resolved, it's better for him to graduate soon. The blonde girl pours some rum. He thanks her. She also serves herself. Soon the two toast and drink. She drank so easily that, surprised, the protagonist comments that she handles alcohol incredibly well. The conversation unfolds until the arrival of the person the protagonist was waiting for, Jong. The protagonist welcomes him. Jong comments, "Long time, Kang," and asks if he has already been discharged from military service because he should have called him when he got out. The protagonist pours a drink and comments that he thought he would be busy looking for a job and asks how he is, adjusting his tie. He says he's surviving. The protagonist comments that he's better off than some seniors who can't find jobs. The protagonist asks if the financial sector is also reducing hires lately. He responds that yes, the bank is doing fine, but new hires at the investment bank next year will be even fewer. Lately, there has been much talk about restructuring and workforce reallocation. One of the extras asks if KYB Azure Insurance is doing well. Jong responds, "What does it matter? KYB and Dory Insurance are merging. It will become the largest in the sector, rising to the top position after the merger of the second and fourth largest companies. The creation of a major BI is good news, but not for employees. Restructuring always comes with mergers." The protagonist asks if he wasn't secure with the new contract. He replies that even new employees are being asked to voluntarily resign, so it's difficult. The protagonist asks what he will do if he quits, where he will go. He mentions he's considering private equity since he's always been very interested in it. The extra comments that after he got a job, he thought everything would be fine, but that doesn't seem to be the case. He agrees, saying it's true. They ask what the purpose of all this is. He replies that there are great entrepreneurs, but there are no great investors. That's the reality of the country. We need someone. Thus, in Korea, to compete confidently against foreign capital, we continue to be criticized by the foreign media for profiting. The protagonist asks when that day will come, and he ironically says that maybe a genius investor will appear, a Korean version of Warren Buffett. The blonde's phone rings. She answers and responds. She begins being at the bar and comments that she can come. Curious, the extra asks who it was. The blonde responds that it was Senior Siona. Originally, she was supposed to meet her today, but when she said she was drinking with them, Siona said she would come. Soon everyone at the table is shocked, and they ask why she called Siona there. The blonde, not understanding, asks what happened, wondering if she shouldn't have called her. However, the lady arrives. She approaches them. The protagonist and she look at each other, creating an unpleasant atmosphere as this was the first time they had met since their breakup. The two go out to talk at a cafe. She asks if he did well in the military service. The protagonist says yes and asks if she is still with that senior. She says yes, they are getting along very well. Kojin Hyung is the senior who briefly visited during the school festival, the third son of GH Constructions, a major corporation. The protagonist saw him briefly, but he seemed handsome and had a good personality. Not long after he enlisted, he heard from Min Young that Seon Ha was dating that senior. Observing her, the antagonist comments that she has changed a lot. She used to be a bit more modest. She responds by saying a lot of time has passed, and soon apologizes for breaking up with him when he was going through a hard time. The protagonist responds, saying it's all in the past, but not with a very good face. She comments that she liked the protagonist a lot. The protagonist, caught off guard by these words, asks what she is talking about. She replies that it might seem strange, but it's true. From the moment she saw him, he seemed different from the others. She always felt confident around him, which is why she liked him. Curious, the protagonist asks why she broke up with him. Shamelessly, she responds that she just took the opportunity when it came. The protagonist asks if the opportunity was the chance to date a rich guy. She dodges the question and says she can't defend herself because she was the one who ended it first. However, she says she wanted to achieve her dreams. A little impatient, the protagonist asks what dreams she is talking about. However, she doesn't answer and gets up from the table, saying she is leaving. The protagonist, curious, also gets up and asks exactly what dream she is talking about, but she doesn't respond. Time passes after the conversation. The protagonist is sitting outside, waiting. He thinks, 2 years ago, even before holding his own father's funeral, they lost the house, and relatives turned their backs. Amidst everything came the news of the breakup with her. He soon felt as if his world was crumbling. Without time to grieve, he joined the army. His mother, left alone, had no choice but to take on difficult work to survive. Thanks to Taek-yu, he made 1.24 billion won and even earned a 60 million won profit from a successful investment. 1.3 billion won came into the protagonist's hands. Success? What exactly is it called? Perhaps 1.3 billion won isn't enough to be called success. While thinking, the great eagle with its splendid golden shine appears ahead. This time, confident, the protagonist offers her a drink and asks what she will show him this time. The large area flies up high and shows him the future, along with a toast. He shouts, "This is my future!" Quickly, he returns to his apartment with his friend. As he wakes up, he calls for him. His friend doesn't want to wake up. The protagonist insists, holding his friend's hand, saying, "Now I've got you. We'll do this together, my friend." His friend, confused, asks, "What exactly do you want?" The protagonist responds, "Success." The day dawns, and the protagonist wakes up with a headache from the drink the night before. His friend comments that he ordered a burger for the protagonist's hangover. The protagonist says, "That's better." Curious, his friend asks if anything happened the night before. The protagonist remembers the eagle clearly, but tells his friend he doesn't recall much. His friend, a bit shocked, asks if he doesn't remember the vow they made the night before with all that determination. The protagonist responds that he does remember, but suggests they talk about it after eating. Soon after, he asks if his friend has ever invested. His friend replies, "No," and the protagonist, surprised, asks if he just withdrew Vant coins. His friend questions if he joined that practical investment group. The protagonist says he studied a bit and made some real investments, but it was only 1 million won, and he lost half, a 50% loss. His friend asks if he didn't go to college. The protagonist responds he attended for just 1 year and acquired some knowledge through a club. His friend asks how much money he has in his account now. His friend responds, $1.225 million. The protagonist remarks, "That's about 13.8 billion won." His friend clarifies that it's without the protagonist's money. The protagonist reflects that such an amount of money is something a normal person might never see in their entire life. Curious, he asks what one could do with all that money for investment purposes. He explains that the size of the capital is essential. To make 100 million won from 10 million, you'd need a 1,000% return. But with 10 billion won, just 1% would suffice. That's why Take could easily make millions, but the risk of losing a lot is also very high. Excited, his friend asks what they could do to get started. The protagonist questions why he wants to invest 13 billion, as he could live comfortably for the rest of his life with that money. However, Taek, driven by greed, says, "The more money, the better." The protagonist understands and admits he can't argue with that. Taek adds, "Besides, it's fun. It feels like a game." He then asks the protagonist what he would like to do if he had a lot of money. The protagonist confesses he doesn't really know, and adds, "To invest, you need foresight. You need an eagle or a sign to appear before you, but it's never clear when or how that will happen." He wasn't sure, but it seemed like a reflex when faced with certain information. Could he really predict financial matters like Taekyu says? The protagonist comments that the first step is acquiring information. In recent days, he has been reading all the latest articles about economics, checking stocks of large companies listed on the stock market, and studying investments. He emphasizes that information is as important as capital. Stock prices, oil prices, gold prices, exchange rates, and bond yields all revolve around information. These days, thanks to a successful disclosure system, institutions and companies are required to share important information. Because of this, he could look at the best and latest news about companies, but public information that people like him can access has little value. Stocks with good news have already risen, and stocks with bad news often show no reaction. He needs insider information, like from Mountain Hill or OPEC. His friend comments that even if he has a sense of foresight about the future, things don't happen immediately. Frustrated, the protagonist sits at the computer desk. He comments that he feels a sense of injustice, and his friend mentions that they should have drafted a contract first. He suggests a contract saying they should split the profit 50-50. Taikyu's sister always said that the closer you are, the clearer these kinds of things should be. However, of course, if he thought the protagonist wasn't someone who would keep promises, he wouldn't have given him 50 million in the first place. The protagonist signs the contract and asks if he is satisfied, then goes to get some coffee. Taich comments that there is no coffee in his house. Soon after, the protagonist's phone rings with a call from an unknown number. Curious, he answers and says his name. The person on the phone says Tim and asks if he remembers her, calling him senior. The protagonist thinks it wasn't that freshman, but quickly comments that yes, he remembers and asks if he could help. She asks if he is free and if he'd like to grab a coffee. Soon, he goes to meet her. The blonde, excited, calls him to her table. He sits and they begin to talk. She asks why he's looking at her that way. The protagonist replies that he thought she was a member of a K-pop girl group he saw in the barracks, noticing her hair. She asks if he's saying she's pretty. The protagonist asks what she's doing there, far from Gangnam. She replies that she lives in Cheongdam, but mentions that luckily her friend's house is here in Gangnam. She comments that he was about to leave to get coffee, thinking it's surprising for a freshman to live in Cheongdam. Curious, he wonders if she's the daughter of a wealthy family. He asks why she wanted to meet him. A bit excited, she responds that she wanted to apologize to him. The protagonist comments, "Oh, so that's it." She slightly bows, apologizes, and explains that she doesn't usually attend department gatherings, so she didn't know. He reassures her that she doesn't need to worry about it. She says she's happy to hear that because she was worried when he left like that. She then asks if he plans to return to university next semester. He replies that if nothing major happens, yes. She says they'll then be in their second year together. Suddenly, she asks if he could do her a favor. Surprised, he asks what favor. She seems a bit excited, and the protagonist notices this. He asks if her apology was just an excuse to ask him out. He begins to think about what to do if she confesses. Should he refuse? However, she's so beautiful that it'd be hard to reject her, yet he's not ready for this. However, it wasn't what he imagined. She suddenly breaks the ice by shouting if he could go with her to exchange her phone because she's too clueless to go alone. After breaking the ice, the protagonist responds, "So that's it," and she urges him to come and hurry. The protagonist feels a bit embarrassed, saying he doesn't know much about electronics. She replies that it's fine, just having him there is enough. He thinks about his friend, who is more experienced in these kinds of electronics and doesn't skimp when it comes to devices he uses. His friend probably knows everything about the latest phone models, especially prices. They go to a phone store. The salesperson asks if she's looking for something specific. The blonde says it's an L6. The salesperson confirms they have it, saying it's one of the best-selling models in recent days. She asks if there's an offer as advertised on the website. The salesperson confirms. The protagonist wonders, if she knows so much, why she wanted him to come with her. Maybe he should take a look too. He picks up the phone on the counter, the L6, and wonders if that's the phone. He used a similar model, the L3, for a long time. However, just as he picks up the phone, the eagle appears. Passing through the wall, the protagonist sees an L6 edition. They continue, curious, wondering what it means. The blonde girl, noticing that he's looking too intently at one spot, asks if there's something there. The protagonist says it's just a mosquito. Shortly after, he leaves the store, and she says she bought a sky blue one because there wasn't any salmon pink, but she liked the color anyway. She then adds that after becoming a slave to installments once again, she must take good care of her phone. The protagonist remarks that this phone model will probably be discontinued soon. Curious, she asks why, though she seems to know the reason but cannot say it. He simply says it's a joke and begins to walk away. Disappointed, she questions why he's leaving so soon. She even considers buying some food for him, but the protagonist quickly arrives at his friend's apartment. His friend asks about all the commotion. The protagonist repeats, L6, L6. His friend immediately shows a phone and asks if this is the one he means. Confirming it, the protagonist asks why he has a pink phone. His friend responds that it's normal for a man to own a pink model. The protagonist explains the situation to his friend, who then asks why he's so focused on this. His friend explains that Seojeong Electronics sells a wide range of smartphones, from entry-level to flagship models. The L series is Seojeong's flagship, but currently, the high-end market is dominated by Enpil, the bitten apple. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Seojeong's L series divides the market in terms of sales and operational profits for top-tier smartphones. However, Enpil overwhelmingly leads. That's why the L6 was developed, to take Enpil's place. There are claims that it surpasses the Enpil 6 in design and performance. Because of this, the L6 is selling like water. The previous generation, the L5, sold 50 million units worldwide, a surprising number. Now predictions exceed 70 million units, and it's likely still selling very well globally. Curious, the protagonist asks the reason for the discontinuation. His friend responds that it might be due to a patent dispute. He's heard that a single smartphone involves over 200,000 patents. Seojeong Electronics, being one of the world's leading IT manufacturers, is involved in various patent disputes across countries. Especially in the early days of smartphones, the patent war with Enpil became famous as the lawsuit of the century. The protagonist comments that even if they lose a patent dispute, they usually just pay damages or patent fees. It's rare for it to lead to a halt in sales. His friend nods and says that, in terms of patents, Seojeong is at an advantage. Unlike Enpil, which pioneered the smartphone era, or other companies that joined later, Seojeong has been making phones since the CMDA era. As a result, they own an enormous number of communication and technology patents. Even when involved in design patent disputes with NPL, they countered with communication patents as their weapons and managed some success. They then wonder what the real issue could be. The protagonist insists the main question is the reason for the discontinuation and when it might happen. The protagonist asks if there's any problem with Seojeong's products that could lead to discontinuation. Taik responds that as far as he knows, there isn't. Even if there were an issue with the phone, they'd repair or compensate for it. It doesn't make sense for them to discontinue it. The protagonist agrees, explaining that a single smartphone contains countless features, commas, and numerous potential software and hardware issues. If manufacturers discontinued products every time a problem arose, they'd all go bankrupt. From the manufacturer's perspective, they'd never do anything that could lead to losses. But why then would such a product with good performance be discontinued? That night, after their conversation, something surprising happens. Taik is screaming. The protagonist hears someone shouting that it exploded. He quickly asks what happened and what could have exploded at this hour of the night. Soon, we see that it was the L6 phone that exploded near Taik. Taik says he was playing while charging it when, all of a sudden, it exploded. He comments that both the charger and the phone are original. Curious, he asks what kind of phone would explode just 1 week after purchase. What kind of bomb would that be? The protagonist remarks that if he had known it was like that, he wouldn't have let her buy that bomb. However, he soon realizes why the device was discontinued. After a quick search, they discover reports of other explosions, some occurring as early as 3 days after the phone's launch. Pictures of explosions start to surface, similar to Take's case of charging while the phone exploded. The company responded quickly, but even after that, there were similar posts on forums and Facebook. If you count the cases that weren't reported, there might be dozens more. Take's friend comments from the manufacturer's perspective, saying they wouldn't want any doubts about their product's quality. It wouldn't be surprising if they paid people to stay silent. The protagonist asks what the company said, and his friend replies that they claimed the explosions were due to external impacts. He explains that phones exploding isn't so rare. The real question is the proportion. Is it 1 in a million or 1 in 10,000? There were other issues besides the explosions, but they didn't affect sales. His friend even thinks that with the launch of the N-Phone 7, the L6 could dominate the market. The protagonist says maybe there's a manufacturing problem. Take's friend argues that the company wouldn't make a mistake that even small companies avoid. Nonetheless, he sees this as an incredible opportunity. The protagonist comments that it's worth waiting because if the company declares discontinuation, everything will end. He also reflects that selling Bantcoin wasn't an investment. It was risk aversion. Even if Mountain Hill doesn't go bankrupt, there's nothing to lose. But this case is different. If it were a small investment, they wouldn't need to think so much. Assuming discontinuation is certain to profit, they need to figure out the timing and its effects to decide how to invest. The protagonist decides to monitor the situation for a few more days. The next day, they gather some information and learn about ongoing investigations. The company is offering refunds as compensation, but the condition for receiving compensation is not posting any information online until the investigations are concluded. It seems there have been many similar cases. The person who visited wasn't a third-party contractor, but from the company itself. He didn't seem surprised when he saw the L6. Judging from what they observed, there were probably many more cases than those online. If it were a simple error, the company wouldn't discontinue the product. However, an explosion is a different matter. Phones are especially sensitive when it comes to safety because people are always carrying them. If Take had been holding the phone when it exploded, he could have been seriously injured. If the explosions continue at this rate, it could justify discontinuing the L6. The company's annual operating profit exceeds 30 trillion, generated by semiconductors, displays, home appliances, phones, and more. 40% of these profits come from smartphones. If the L6 is discontinued, they'll lose 40% of their operating profit. Take responds that it won't be that bad, as the company has older models and entry-level phones, but it will definitely hurt them. He adds that just the refunds alone would cost 6 trillion if each device costs 1 million. Considering the expected profits and the drop in brand value, the losses will multiply. The protagonist comments that the real question is when to invest. If they anticipate good news, they can buy shares beforehand. But with bad news, the options are limited. Take asks if this isn't already a discovery. The protagonist agrees and mentions that with OTK Company, a foreign firm, it would be easier for a black-haired investor to take advantage. The discovery itself isn't difficult. It's about regular investment. Buy and then sell. The sale and discovery consist of borrowing stocks, selling them, and buying them back at a lower price to pay back and make a profit. The issue is the profit margin. Even if you sell the stocks for 100 million and buy them back for 10 million, the profits are limited to 99%, but no stock drops that much. Even if the foundation is shaky, the drop would only be 20 to 30% at most. So, they will invest 13 billion to earn between 23 to 4 billion, which is a huge margin. However, the protagonist wants to earn just a little more. To earn a bit more, his friend asks about future options. The protagonist says he doesn't know about derivatives. With the small funds they had in the club, they wouldn't even come close to the market. Currently, they have $12.5 million, which is enough to try for real. But they need someone who knows derivatives. The protagonist dismisses his friend's sister. His friend asks why, and the protagonist says, "What if she asks what we're basing this on?" His friend says to just tell her, just say you trust your prediction. The protagonist asks why his friend always underestimates his sister in these situations and says he knows someone. His friend asks who, and the protagonist replies, Park Sang-yap, the president of the Real Investment Club. Some call him a lunatic, and others call him a genius. There are two types of geniuses in the world, those who shine in several areas and those who are incredible in just one. Mr. Sang belongs to the second category. He grew up in Australia, so English isn't a problem for him, but his grades were below average. The reason he managed to enter Korea University as a special talent was because he's a math prodigy. Watching fourth-year classes since his first year, he became obsessed with a problem the professor presented, going without food or sleep for 3 days until he solved it. Afterward, he joined Siltari. He became interested in the stock market and got deeply involved. While he enjoyed simulated investments, what caught his attention was a small company listed on KOSDAQ called QMK Tech. As a math genius, he predicted a 10-fold increase in the company's stock value. Thinking he couldn't miss the opportunity, he used $5 million in rent money to buy QMK stocks and then moved out of a friend's house to a club for 2 weeks. QMK Tech hit and exceeded the limit multiple times due to its ties to IoT, which was booming. In approximately 2 months, the stagnant stocks rose 10-fold. So, his $5 million investment turned into $50 million. Having succeeded in his first investment, he dedicated himself to corporate analysis. Although he sometimes lost a bit, he consistently made profits. By the time the protagonist joined the club, Sang's funds had turned into $300 million, a massive amount that students couldn't even imagine. A normal person would have been satisfied, but he didn't think it was enough. What he regretted was the initial investment fund. If he had invested $100 million at the start, he would have made $6 billion. To get higher returns, he researched and analyzed the options market. Once confident, the stock that caught his attention was CL Chemical. He determined that CL Chemical was undervalued and predicted a 2-fold increase in its value. He sold everything and bought CL Chemical stocks. But a few days later, disaster struck. An employee was caught in a scam and transferred money to the wrong account, losing 20% of CL Chemical's quarterly profits, or $27 million. As a result, the stock prices plummeted and the value of the options he bought collapsed in seconds. Instead of liquidating, he took a risk, borrowed money from a loan shark at the maximum interest rate, and bought even more shares. The days passed and the stock prices didn't recover. By then, he had invested over $300 million. When he couldn't pay back the loan shark began getting aggressive and Sang disappeared. Later, CL Chemical's stock price rose, but that's another story. If he had bought real stocks, his $300 million investment would have turned into $700 million. But since he bought options, he earned nothing. The protagonist meets him a few days later, after a long time without seeing each other. Sang asks who the friend beside the protagonist is. The protagonist introduces him. Curious, Sang asks if it's the guy who bought Bantcoin in school and says it's a pity. If he had found his wallet, he'd be rich now. Changing the subject slightly, the protagonist asks what he's been up to since dropping out of college. Sang replies that he's done some odd jobs, worked in construction, and driven for some shows. Things like that. Currently, he's teaching math in a prep course for college entrance exams. Earning money like this made him realize even a 101 coin is valuable. Then he says he's $2 million in debt and only needs to work for a few months. The protagonist thinks about how Sang went from billions to being in debt. Normally, people like that would fall into despair and give up. However, Sang isn't an ordinary person. He asks why the protagonist is looking for him. The protagonist begins by saying he wants to learn more about options. Sang asks if he has ever seen a futures and options account. The protagonist says that's not a problem. Sang explains that futures and options are derivatives, and he needs to understand the difference. With his notebook in hand, the protagonist says he knows roughly. Contracts known as futures are agreements where both parties commit to trading a specific quantity of a commodity at a future date. For example, In December, the price is set at 5,000 units. The goal is to lock in a fixed value without changes in prices. It is a promise to trade at a single price. Whether you profit or lose depends on the price on the day of the contract. Currently, the price of radishes is 9,000 per unit, meaning the buyer would profit and the seller would lose. Regardless of profit or loss, both parties are obligated to fulfill the contract. On the other hand, with options, you are selling the right to trade. Options are based on an expiration date. Naturally, each option has a seller and a buyer, and the right to exercise the option depends on the buyer. Tyke questions whether this would put the seller at a disadvantage. Sang responds that this is one of the fun aspects of options, but in the market, the delivery rate is higher for sellers, and the risk is unlimited. That's why they proceed cautiously. Tyke gives an example. They could profit whether prices go up or down. Sang agrees, but provides an extreme example. Let's say there is a put option with a low probability of success. If the buyer had purchased 1 billion of this stock, the payout would be 9 trillion. Of course, this almost never happens. Bad news is more frequent than good, and when it does happen, the price of put options skyrockets by hundreds of times, forcing the seller to pay. Tyke starts to understand. Sang advises them not to mess with options carelessly, and asks what they plan to do exactly. The protagonist replies, Seoseong Electronics. Sang asks, buy or sell options. The protagonist says, sell. Sang questions why, pointing out that the L6 was just launched. The protagonist comments that the L6 will be discontinued. Sang wonders if they're referring to the L6 explosions. The protagonist confirms, saying, even Luciana has confirmed it. If they continue like this, they'll have to discontinue it. Sang asks if that's all or if the protagonist has other evidence. The protagonist hints at having more but cannot share it. Disappointed Song, who has already faced a tragedy, warns against dealing with options recklessly as it can lead to bankruptcy. The protagonist agrees. After leaving the cafe, the protagonist tells his friend that he could lose everything at once and asks if he still wants to proceed. Determined, the friend says yes and asks if the protagonist is in too. The protagonist finally says, let's try.